Hello, my name is Sydney Manning, and today I'm going to be talking about the Boston Tea Party. So, the main question I am asking today is how did economic oppression of the American colonists lead to the Boston Tea Party? So, the short answer and my thesis is that economic oppression of the colonists, such as the Townshend Acts and the Tea Acts from the British Parliament, led to the colonists' rebellion over the misrepresentation and economic burdens, therefore resulting in the Boston Tea Party. So before we dive in to focusing on the Townshend Acts and the Tea Act, we are going to look at some context that happened beforehand and what led up to these acts and resulted in the Boston Tea Party. The first major context that's important is the French and Indian War, which was from 1754 to 1763, and this was super important because the British were against the French and the Native Americans at the time, and created a large sum of debt for the English. So, like the good protector that Great Britain was, they thought that the colonists should help to pay back for their protection during the war. And so a series of taxes were raised and sent to the colonists to pay back a portion of the debt. The first official tax that was raised against the colonists was the Sugar Act of 1764. This tax was put in place to help deal with the smuggling of molasses and sugar goods from the Caribbean. And after there were grievances in multiple states, Great Britain eventually repealed the act and traded it in with the Revenue Act. The Stamp Act of 1765 was put in place for direct taxation to the colonists on things like newspaper, mail, postage of all kinds, and the colonists were obviously very upset about this. And this was the act that formed the slogan, "Taxation without representation," where we can see the colonists felt very misrepresented by Parliament and had no say in the taxes that were being burdened upon them. The Boston Massacre of 1770 was not a tax, but a massacre or riot amongst the colonists and British troops that were being housed in Boston over issues with the Quartering Act, and causing a riot amongst them and killing almost 13 people. The engraving above by Paul Revere, many say was exaggerated the riot in effect. It raised a lot of patriotism for the colonists, and the tensions among the colonists and the British grew stronger. So now that we have covered the majority of the context surrounding the main focal point of our time period, we are going to transition into talking about how the Townshend Acts and the Tea Acts especially were economic burdens that led to the Boston Tea Party. The Townshend Acts of 1767 and 1768 were comprised of two acts, the Revenue and Indemnity Acts, and the Revenue Act focused on taxing items such as lead, paint, tea, glass, where the Indemnity Act focused on more of a tax break for the East India Company, and this harmed colonial sailor ships and their economy. So just wanted to show an example of the Townshend Acts, and this is the document that Parliament released. And as you can see, it is very specific, and there are a lot of items that are taxed on here. And again, it really upset the colonists. It was a huge economic blow to them and benefited them in no way whatsoever, but benefited Britain majorly. So the Townshend Acts are named after Charles Townshend, who was the British Chancellor of the Exchequer, and he ironically died before the acts were actually even officially passed. But because of his actions, it created greater conflicts between the colonies and Great Britain, and the tensions arose, which led to the Boston Tea Party. So further looking into Charles Townshend's direct impact on The Townshend Acts. This is an excerpt from Robert Chaffin's journal from 1970, and as you can see, he explains how Townshend wasted little time transforming his ideas on American taxation into reality. So tying back into that Indemnity Act portion of the Townshend Act, the second one, you can see here that he really wanted there to be economic benefits for Britain and not the colonists. So as you can see, in negotiations with the East India Company in the spring of '67, the government agreed to lower the inland duty on teas consumed in England and allow a full rebate on all teas going to Ireland and America. So also just adding on to this really shows how there was no representation of the American colonists. All of these decisions were really made for the economic gain of Great Britain. And as you can see here, it says it caused the price of tea to drop, increased exports to the colonies, and placed the company in a stronger position against smugglers and its continental competitors. So as you can understand, it is obvious that this would greatly upset the colonists, as they could see as much as Townshend did that this was an economic benefit for Great Britain, and that the colonists were really receiving the short end of the stick. And this was already, midway after the colonists had already felt that they were being misrepresented in Parliament, and this added to the conflict between them and Great Britain. So we looked at the point of view from Charles Townshend on his benefits of the Townshend Acts, and now we are going to discuss the reactions from the colonists and how you can see the tensions arising because of the economic burden. So the first reaction here is from New York City, the Tradesmen's Resolves in September 1768, soon after the act was passed. And basically what it is saying here is that the colonists are saying that they will not purchase any goods or merchandise imported by Europe until they revoke the tax. So what's interesting about this response is that although they are protesting all of the goods and the taxes that are being imported from Great Britain, the last clause here, fifthly, says that they're still the dutiful subjects of the king and that they have the most gratitude for him. But it's basically saying that they are being used for the benefit of the crown, and it is not any way to treat their loyal subjects, and it is not in the best interest of the colonies, and they want no part of it. So as you can see, there's a little bit of conflict here between the colonists, still wanting to be loyal subjects to the king, but also struggling with this concept of taxation without representation. So anyways, the basic fact is that they did end up protesting this act, and as you can see, they were saying, we are not buying anything until this act is repealed. This is too harsh for our economy. It was harming all the colonists' economy. So as you can see, the conflicts are really starting to strengthen between Great Britain and the colonists. So the second source here is from a series of letters from a Pennsylvania farmer, and these gained popularity with the opposition to the Townshend Acts. And as you can see here, he is saying that the single question is whether the Parliament can legally impose duties to be paid by the people of the colonies for the sole purpose of raising a revenue, or can Parliament legally take money out of our pockets without our consent? And the ending, most interesting, says, if they can, our boasted liberty is but a sound and nothing else. So as you can see, these letters are really starting to fuel the conflict between Great Britain and the colonists. They really are done being a pawn in their game. They don't want to be used as an economic commodity anymore. And this kind of ties back into the taxation without representation, where the colonists were really feeling the burden of these taxes being imposed on them, especially as a farmer. He was struggling. He even compared them to being slaves to Great Britain, based on the fact that if, they don't refuse this tax, that they could be compared to slaves as just taking it. So I think it's really important here to see that this conflict is starting to rise in the colonists, and they really are starting to protest this. So the New York protesters were correct in their prediction, and because they refused to pay anything, and also considering that Charles Townshend had died shortly before the act was passed, it kind of lost its strength a little bit, and the new chancellor repealed the Townshend Acts, but was still afraid of losing kind of his political power and position, so he kept the Tea Act in place. Also, just to kind of close this chapter, I also wanted to bring up the aspect that these conflicts were arising rather quickly, and the result of these Townshend Acts actually loosely led to the Boston Massacre as well, where we can really see the conflict of the soldiers and the colonists struggling to battle with the economic burdens. The Tea Act of 1773, in simplest terms, was a taxed import on tea from Great Britain that they sent to the colonies in order to save the economically failing East India Company from debt and economic peril. I also wanted to include this very simplified map of the trade routes of the East India Company. As you can see, it circulates around Asia and the Southern Hemisphere with goods and spices, transfers it back to Great Britain, and heads it to the colonies and the Caribbean as well. As if the colonists were not already upset enough with the Townshend Acts, the Tea Act of 1773 seemed to bolster and support the Townshend Acts even further. So, further looking at the reactions of the colonists on the Tea Act, this was a pivotal moment and extremely upsetting for the colonists as well. As you can see, number 2 here says that the duty imposed by Parliament upon tea landed in America is a tax on the Americans, levying contributions on them without their consent. So this ties back into the taxation without representation. And this taxation without representation further irritated the colonists. They already felt like they were being misrepresented in Parliament, and this act was really the tipping point for them. And based on their responses here, you can see how easily it was for them to start to form ideas of rebellion and revolution. I also wanted to point out an important aspect is number 6 here that says it is the duty of every American to oppose this attempt. So as we can see here, the American people are really starting to rally around this idea of Americanism and how they are feeling kind of a sense of community, and many people are starting to oppose this rule from so far away. Circling back to this source of number 7 here that says, whoever shall directly or indirectly countenance this attempt, later on goes to say, is an enemy to his country. So again, this is really seen as the tipping point that leads to the Boston Tea Party, as the citizens of Philadelphia especially are starting to feel that they are an independent country and that they're being misrepresented from Great Britain. This source is from a debate in the New York Gazetteer on the 2nd of December, 1773, so just about 2.5 weeks before the Boston Tea Party took place. And this is in response to a pro-British stance on the Tea Party Act. And as much as it explains how there was taxation without representation, it also offers the solution of using no tea, at least for the present, and that anyone who does is seen as a mortal enemy to American freedom. So again, here we can really see that patriotism starting to take place and forming the opinions of anti-British sentiment. So again, this source is a great example of how this anti-British sentiment is starting to lead to talk amongst people. Tying back to that taxation without representation, people are starting to understand that something needs to be done to get Britain's attention, and that this is the final straw for them, that they are not just any other subjects to Great Britain, that they deserve representation. So, as we can see from the sources, It is obvious that the American people were done being a pawn in Great Britain's economic scheme. They were done paying for the debts that Britain had to pay off, that they had nothing to do with, and they did not want to be responsible for the economic downfall of the East India Company, and as a result, decided to take a stance against the British with the Boston Tea Party.
Okay, so finally we are going to touch on the Tea Party and just the result of all this pent-up conflict and aggression between the economic issues between the British and the colonists. So as a result of Britain's harsh taxation without representation, the colonists reached their breaking point, and on the night of December 16th, the colonists, a lot of them dressed up as Native Americans, and dumped more than 340 chests of tea into the Boston Harbor, amounting to about $18,000, or in today's money, around $1 million worth of tea. Much of the protest was said to be formed by Samuel Adams, the founder of the Sons of Liberty, and as a result of this, the colonists felt as though they had really kind of shown Great Britain that they were not to be messed with, that the conflict had arose to something that couldn't have just been handled through more taxation, that they were headed towards the point of rebellion. So this source is really interesting. This is a song that was sung after the Boston Tea Party, and as you can see, they talk about liberty, freedom, taking a stand, and it's interesting because they talk about the tea that sunk in spite of our foes, which is interesting because that alludes to the fact that they were now considering Great Britain an enemy of theirs, as before they were, still being seen as loyal subjects. So this is just a really good example of how all of the economic burdens that Great Britain was imposing on the colonists, such as the Townshend Acts and the Tea Act, came to a boiling point, and the colonists felt that they had to act out in a way that would be remembered forever. So as I said, it definitely was an act that was remembered forever, as this source is John Adams' response to the Boston Tea Party, and he says that the people should never rise without doing something to be remembered, something notable and striking. The destruction of the tea is so bold, so daring, so firm, intrepid and inflexible, and it must have been so important consequences and so lasting that I can't but consider it as an epocha in history. So after this boiling point of all the economic turmoil, the colonists knew what they had done, and as you can see here, it obviously says that this is something notable, this is something striking. No other colony has acted out like this against Great Britain, so it was just a really great demonstration of them protesting the goods and the economic burdens that were being thrust upon them. So just to conclude how impactful the Townshend Acts and the Tea Acts were on the Boston Tea Party and resulted in the Boston Tea Party, as we've seen through the responses of colonists on these imposed acts, and just the responses of the new slogan of taxation without representation, and the colonists seeming to feel more independent from Great Britain. Whereas before these acts were in place, they were most loyal subjects to the king, and we can kind of see a turning point here, that these acts really caused a rebellion, really caused a rouse through all the colonists. They realized they were not wanting to be taken advantage of by Great Britain, and that they were being taxed without being represented, and overall just being taken advantage of for the economic gain of Great Britain. So as we saw, the Townshend Acts, which were a harsh set of acts on many of the imports that the colonists received, and was also a tax break for the East India Company, as well as the Tea Act, which was a harsh act enforced on the goods being imported to the Boston Harbor. Both resulted in rising tensions and conflicts between Great Britain and the colonists, and resulted in the Boston Tea Party. Thank you so much for watching, and please see my sources and citations attached with the document below.